I recently came across a discussion online that prompted me to ask the question, does migration to Paraguay from the place where we came from and other places, Europe, US and so forth, have a positive impact on the country, or does it have a negative impact? The nature of the discussion that I'm referring to was in reference to residence application, and there was a discussion about whether there should be an increase in application fees. Some people were even proposing some form of incoming residence tax that should be applied to people coming here. Ironically, the people that were having a discussion were people that had come here as foreigners themselves. So it got me really thinking about the question, and I think on the face of it, it's a reasonable question for anyone to ask. When you move to a country, I think it's incumbent upon you to at least ask the question, is the country benefiting from me going there? If that question was asked more often, perhaps some countries wouldn't be in the mess that they're currently in. But I examined that question as it applies to Paraguay, and I came to some realisations and conclusions myself. What are some of the things that people would say are negatives in terms of people moving to Paraguay? Well, one of the immediate and obvious things that people sometimes refer to is the property market. There is a train of thought that goes along the lines that people moving to Paraguay are placing pressure on the property market and causing the prices to rise. And on the face of it, I think that there's some evidence to support that proposition. If you look at real estate websites, particularly the bigger, more professional ones, you can see some really significant prices. And I think that I've noticed prices go up in some of those forums since the time that we've been here. But there's more to this than meets the eye, because we know quite a few people around the area that we live, both foreigners and Paraguayans. And what I came to realise, in any particular area, you can find a property that you know has been sold to a foreigner at a really steep price. But in the very same area, I know people, local Paraguayans who live in those areas, who have purchased their property not too long ago at really reasonable prices. So what seems to be happening here is that there's a two-tier economy when it comes to real estate. There's the foreigner economy, where foreigners are buying property either from professional websites or from other foreigners. And then there's a local real estate economy that's often by word of mouth or advertised in forums where foreigners may not be looking. And there is no doubt about it, there are two very distinct price points depending on where you're looking. So although I do concede that in some cases foreigners do tend to hike up the prices of certain properties, it's very clear that that's not the case across the board. One thing that exasperates this is that in Paraguay there are no solid data sets that you can refer to. There's no solid statistics that you can call upon to nail down a reliable price per hectare in any given area. You can have one plot of land that is one particular price and another plot of land very close to it's a totally different price. There is no relationship between the two. And anyone that claims they do have some sort of handle on the price points in particular areas, well, they need to be very careful about how they put that forward. Although you can look in areas and say around this area, there's kind of a ballpark, but there's definitely a lot of variance at both ends of the market. And all I would say is that there is ample room still for locals here to buy at a price that would be in line with the demographic of those people buying. So I don't think that the case can be made necessarily that foreigners are really hiking up property prices here in Paraguay. There is some evidence of it, but it's not really a phenomenon, say compared to the place where we've moved from, where if you're a young person without any significant means, you're going to really struggle to get on the property market. I know people here who have house and land, a young family, working very humble jobs, and they're doing fine. They may not be living in luxury as compared to what we may have been used to in places we've come from. They have a house, a land, sustaining a family, and they're doing okay. So I think there's some merit in the property argument, but I don't think it's really made out to the extent that a lot of people would perhaps suggest. Another area that I often hear referred to in terms of issues relating to people moving to Paraguay is in the area of social cohesion. What are the rub points between the cultures that are coming in and Paraguayans that are here? Well, it's inevitable. Whenever people come into a new country, there will be rub points. There will be points of friction. We've seen this just recently. It's a fairly mild example, I guess. We were at a local cafe, one of our favourite haunts, and we're inside the cafe. And on that particular day, there were mostly foreigners, a lot of them sitting around smoking inside the premises. Well, that's not only offensive in a lot of countries, it's actually illegal. Here in Paraguay, although I'm not sure whether there's any law to prohibit it, I know that a lot of locals are really quite disgusted by it. But not only locals, there's also a lot of foreigners that are also pretty peeved off. I spoke to the proprietor. They weren't particularly happy, but given that most of their clientele on that particular day were foreigners, they were kind of putting up with it. But that is an example that I have seen where there's kind of some pretty grubby behaviour from people coming here, and they probably need to check themselves. It's not the worst thing that you'll see in terms of people moving to a country and their behaviour, but it certainly isn't ideal. Apart from that, I haven't seen any real flagrant examples of major stress points. Of course there would be. Around the country there would be definitely points of issue with different cultures and different groups, people who have moved here and locals, but there certainly is nowhere near the sort of dramas that you'd see in a lot of other countries. So again, although I think there is some case to be made that there's some issues that maybe need to be improved on in terms of the relationship, I think in general it's a really harmonious relationship overall, and I think that incoming people are getting on really well with Paraguayans, and the country is really quite socially cohesive and harmonious, at least in our experience. So with that out of the way, I'd like to turn a discussion to why I would say that people coming to Paraguay is a really great benefit to the country. First of all, there are no free rides in Paraguay. You can't move here and jump on a social security benefit. There's no social welfare nets that foreigners can tap into. When you arrive, you have to pay a reasonably substantial fee. If you come as a family, then it's really substantial. And from day one, you have to house yourself, feed yourself. A lot of people have their own private health insurance. They're not a burden on the health sector. So overall, it's really sink or swim. And anyone that I know that's moved here has funded themselves all the way and will continue to do so. So there's no concern that somehow the country's missing out in that regard. Paraguay is a sparsely populated country. It has a population of only about 6.9 million, and roughly half of all those people live in the precinct of Asuncion and surrounds. About 68% live in urbanised areas, so that leaves about 17 people per square kilometre outside of urban areas in terms of the population density. So the spread of population across the country is really quite sparse. But bearing in mind there are swathes of the country that are really quite inhospitable. But nevertheless, in many parts of the country, there really is a lack of people living there in some ways. And that can be demonstrated in this way. Many parts of the country have been designated, earmarked and surveyed to be relatively high density living. In parts of the region that we live, there are many developments where significant tracts of land have been subdivided up into building size lots. But what's also evident is that most of those developments are relatively untouched. They don't have the population in those areas to develop those plots. So you have many developments sitting there undeveloped. You have a rapidly improving road system throughout the country. So in terms of accessibility to these regional areas, it's increasingly not a problem. But the real issue is that there aren't people to buy those plots of land and to build on them and develop those areas. Of course, in some cases, people from Asuncion are buying those pieces of land and sometimes building weekenders where they'll go and stay for their holidays and so forth. But that's not really developing those projects. You might have a small house on there with a pool, but it really is clearly a weekender, and it doesn't really have a commitment to the infrastructure like you would see if someone built a genuine house and lived there full time. So where are these people going to come from? I would posit that if you have more people coming from overseas, particularly if they're inclined to want to move outside of the urban precincts, that's a really good resource to call upon to hopefully buy and develop these plots of land and in time develop those areas. And it has been our experience, a lot of the people that we meet do in fact want to live outside of Asuncion and outside of the urban areas. A lot of people that are coming from the place where we came from and Europe and elsewhere tend to want to live out in the rural areas. Paraguay is a relatively underpopulated country when you look at its neighbours. Argentina has 45.6 million, Bolivia 12.4 million, Brazil 212 million people. Paraguay sitting at 6.9 million. It's really below par in terms of its neighbours. And not that population is necessarily everything, but I do think that there's a case to say that given the population of the neighbours and the fact that those populations can be sustained in those land masses, Paraguay really could easily accommodate quite a few more people than it currently does. Foreigners already actually do a lot of the heavy lifting in Paraguay in terms of the social needs of the country. Just in the area that I live, just a relatively short car ride away is a tremendous hospital, the Mennonite Hospital. It's funded by a group of German-speaking Mennonite churches here in Paraguay. That hospital is amazing. It does amazing work for the community. Anyone can go there. The service is really brilliant. We've actually been there a couple of times ourselves, and I couldn't imagine how this area would be without that facility. It's brilliant. In addition to that, I know of several world-class animal rescue facilities here in Qroo that are funded, managed, resourced, staffed predominantly by foreigners. So there are many examples of social benefit from foreigners coming and bringing their resource both here and also being able to draw on resource further afield. And I'm sure that's a common story throughout the country. But that's not only actually in Paraguay. When we first moved to Guatemala, the small town that we lived in there, the local hospital, one of the schools, the old age home were all operated and managed and resourced by foreigners. It's not an uncommon story right throughout Latin and South America. So there is a lot of social good that comes with foreigners coming to the country, at least in the case of Paraguay, and as it relates to things like hospitals and animal shelters and so forth. That in itself is a really great benefit to foreigners coming here. There's no need to fear that Paraguay will be overwhelmed by people coming here from the place where we come from and further afield. If you take the 5 years previous to 2024 in terms of the amount of people that came into the country, and you average that number out over that 5-year period, well, in 2024, there was 12,451 people less come in 2024 than the average for that 5 years. So you're not seeing vast waves of people coming in and somehow overburdening the country. It's not happening really at all. And if anything, there may be a case to increase the amount of people coming here. So there's no concern about that. And the final reason that I would say that people coming to Paraguay is good for the country is because Paraguay is really in a great position to handle it. It's a young country in terms of its population. 27 is the median age. Compared to countries around it, it's doing really well economically. So the economic outlook for Paraguay is really positive, and it would seem to be the ideal time when the country is still young. The economy has shown several years of progression, particularly in relation to its neighbours. I'm not an economist, but I would suspect that a country in that position would benefit from an influx of people coming with a good resource base and being prepared to stand on their own 2 feet, and inevitably bringing in an array of expertise, experience and skills. It can't be a bad thing. So Paraguay is in a really good position to sustain at least the influx of residents that it's receiving presently, and I would think many more on top of that. Overall, I would contend that Paraguay is getting a really good deal in regards to people coming here. And in return, I think that people coming to Paraguay are also getting a great deal. They're enjoying 2 amazing aspects of Paraguay. I think in some regards, they're 2 of the most valuable things about this country. One is it's really politically stable, and 2, it is relatively sane when you compare it to a lot of other countries in the world today. It's not tearing itself apart by pointless political and social concerns and just dramas. It's just getting on with its life. It's just not embroiled in the sort of BS that's going on in a lot of the rest of the world. So coming from another country like we have, and most of the people that we speak to that have come from other countries, so appreciative of this country. Paraguay and those coming to Paraguay are a really good match. I think that both are really benefiting, and I think it's a really good case to support the proposition that at the very least people should continue to come here, if not in bigger numbers, at least in the numbers that they're coming now. And just returning to the question of should the prices of applying for residence here in Paraguay be increased, or should there be some sort of increased tax? I just think that's ridiculous. It's one thing for someone to propose that if they're saying it just for themselves, but in a lot of cases there's families coming. So when you look at the fees as they stand now, and then you factor in maybe 4 or 6 or more people in a family, it's a really significant sum to have to invest in order to get your residence here in the country. I'm not saying it's not worthwhile or it's not competitive to other countries, but when you look at it in that frame of reference, I think that the deal is really fair and reasonable. The fees are reasonable, the process is straightforward. And so all in all, I think there's a really good balance, and I definitely don't think that there's a case to be made to get all silly about it and go all hyper-taxed or anything like that. But, you know, there's some funny people out there with some funny ideas. They're my thoughts for what it's worth. Just my opinion as always, and I'm sure there's many other differing opinions out there. If anyone would like to talk to us about Paraguay or get more information about any part of the process, we offer a consultation online. The details are below. You can book a session with Brenda and I, and we seek to answer all your questions. We're really here to help people make a smooth transition to Paraguay, hopefully avoid some of the mistakes, and just make a go of it, because that's what it's all about. We're all in this together. Any comments, suggestions, or things that I haven't covered, please let me know in the comments below. And until next time, take care. Ciao.